can't hear me? That is a total shock. Oh, okay. Or irresponsible disclosure and or standards for disclosure, or should there be a standard for disclosure? And if there is a standard for disclosure or a guideline perhaps for responsible disclosure, does that make it legal? Is there any non-repudiation? Is there something that would be a de facto standard for, let's say, Katie, if in fact she presented a disclosure or a vulnerability or an exploit, and then it came back to her for doing due diligence, and it was, spread nationwide? Whose responsibility is what? To respond, to report. So those are the things that we'd like to talk about today. Not too in-depth, but I'd like to be very controversial. I don't think we're going to have a problem with that. So to begin with, I'd like to start with Stefano introducing himself because he's from Milan, and I'm not going to say the verbiage correctly, who he represents. Politecno di la Viva?
Wow. You pride yourself with being Italian, so you should be able to say Politecnico di Milano. Yeah, my name is Stefano. I'm a professor at Politecnico di Milano, which is Italy's largest technical university. We have 38,000 students graduating in engineering. 120 of them take my computer security course. During the computer security course, they have a hacking lab where they learn how to hack applications. And after that, they begin to try to hack into the other applications of the university. And so basically every year we have like 100, 120 bug reports to file with the university administration. No penal cases yet. I'm counting on having some by the end of this year. And that's part of my experience in vulnerability discovery. The other part is I founded 6 years ago a company called Secure Network, which is doing security research. Our guys have been presenting at Blackhat for years, actually. So you may have seen some of them, Luca Carrettoni or Claudio Criscione, who just ended up presenting our latest research on virtualization penetration testing. So we do have, I have a lot of experience on how to report vulnerabilities and how scary responses from the vendor may be sometimes, but I will talk about that later.
Thank you. Ira?
I'm Ira Winkler. Ira Winkler. So you start out at NSA doing stuff, breaking into things, did other stuff there. What else? Found some vulnerabilities, ran antivirus and firewall product certification programs, consulted, do penetration testing, and write stuff.
Hi, I'm Katie Masouras. I'm a senior security strategist with Microsoft. I'm in the MSRC, the Microsoft Security Response Center. And, in terms of disclosure roles, you may know me from such disclosure roles as being a finder. I was one of the artists formerly known as At Stake before we were acquired by Symantec. I founded Symantec Vulnerability Research, and that was the first research program in Symantec's history to allow the publication of original research from essentially a lot of the at-stake consultants who were accustomed to being able to publish their research through responsible disclosure. And then about 3 years ago, I joined Microsoft. And a couple of years ago, actually, at Blackhat, we announced one of the other programs I founded, which is Microsoft Vulnerability Research. And let's see. So I have been, a finder. I've been a coordinator. I've certainly been a vendor. I am, on the vendor side right now. And I've also been, on the security response side for vendors of, obviously closed source software, but also open source software. About 10 years ago, I was a Linux developer. It's okay, they know about that. And at that time, I founded, essentially the Security Response Center for a small Linux operating system company, and I handled it soup to nuts, in terms of I actually rolled the patches myself, and I put them up on the FTP site. So
rolled patches? Do you want to elaborate on the rolling?
Well, we can get to that later, but yeah.
We'll go to Dan soon here.
Yeah, put it this way: if you roll your own patches, for God's sake, don't smoke them. So, anyway, so I've been at a lot of different roles in the disclosure debate, and last week, as part of what we're doing in the ecosystem strategy team, we talked about dropping the old responsible adjective out of disclosure. and instead going with something more rational, objective. So, we would like to call it coordinated vulnerability disclosure, and we can talk more about what that means a little bit later. I'm going to give the mic to Dan now.
Thanks, Katie. Dan? First of all, who doesn't know Dan? No hands go up. Shock. Go ahead, Dan.
Oh. Well, I'm Dan. Apparently you guys know me. You probably all know about the finding of the DNS flaw, a horribly difficult thing which took 2 days. The fixing of the DNS flaw has been a rather longer and still ongoing to this day endeavor. Like most of the people on this panel, I've played multiple roles in the disclosure side. It wasn't just a bug that was found. I basically had to live with the consequences of the find in a fairly direct manner of actually dealing with the remediation. So when people talk about how long it takes to patch a bug, I've lived through that process through actually multiple name servers. So yeah, that's all I gotta say.
He lives to talk about it. And I'm Pamela Fusco. I've been in the information security arena about 24 years now. I started out as a cryptographer, and then I went on to become the chief security officer of Merck Pharmaceutical and Citigroup, so drugs and money. And before that, I was with a company called Digex, which was one of the very first managed service providers, and we're talking about this whole cloud and virtualization. Been there, done that. We did that like 10 years ago. We're still doing it. So that's my background, and I've been on all sides as well, giving, receiving, reporting, mitigating, exploits, risks, bugs, patches, you name it, the blaster, slammer, all that stuff. Lived through that too back in the day. So what we're going to talk about here is, have lessons learned. Did we learn anything? Is anything different today than it was before? And also kind of what Dan said, we touched on in the beginning is, what happens to the person that does report a bug or a fix? Is it worth even doing at this point in time with all the aggravation that you may have to go through as an individual or an organization? So the first thing I'd like to ask the panel is, and I talk a little too fast sometimes. I'm from New York and I had a lot of Starbucks today. That's a result of the Qualis party last night and some of the Net Witnesses party, so I'll try and slow it down a little bit, if you will. So the first question I'd like to ask the panelists is, what does full disclosure mean to you? Stefano.
Okay. May I get... Here. Okay. So we were discussing this with Ira earlier, actually. On one side, I must say that I've been hearing this debate for a very long time, and I began looking at and using, and I will not comment any further, vulnerabilities in 1996, 1997, and this debate was already, beginning to start. And, well, full disclosure means originally just to release every detail of a bug finding that you made. So, actually, there's no real, it's not like it's two different things. Are you pro full disclosure or pro responsible disclosure? It's not two different opposing things to me. But usually, nowadays, when you talk about responsible or full disclosure, you mean to put them in comparison, in contrast, where full disclosure means you disclose details as soon as you find them or as soon as you want them to disclose them, and you don't care about coordinating with the vendor. So I must say that actually, when I read about the new name that Katie proposed for coordinated vulnerability disclosure, I think that is actually a much better fit to describe what it is about than responsible, because responsible is emotionally charged. So I don't know. I would not publicly call someone else irresponsible or say, okay, this is responsible just to mean this other thing is not.
But the question is just full disclosure,
yeah,
responsibility.
Yeah. Full disclosure means that you are going to teach the others everything about the bug. So how the bug was discovered, how the bug can be exploited, and what are the consequences of a bug. Just contrast this with the usual CVE entry, which just tells you, there's a bug here, update to this version, and look, maybe sometimes there's a link that says, here there's additional information. But if vulnerability disclosures were all like CERT or CVE entries, then we would not have all the details. This is what we used to do before full disclosure took place, actually. And there's a set of historical reasons that I'm pretty sure many of the people in the audience know why this has happened, actually. So I will just pass by to Ira, which I'm sure is a very different opinion than mine on this topic. So,
no, I mean, generally we have the same definition of full disclosure. The issue is what the actual implementation is and the implication, because there always seems to be the full disclosure versus responsible disclosure camps, and the full disclosure people say, let's put everything out there, let's do it. The question that is not addressed in the terms by definition is when, which comes under responsibility, but the point of the fact is when people say they're for full disclosure, inevitably it does mean that they're for full disclosure whenever they damn well seem to want to do it. That's what the definition of full disclosure is in practice. You can have a dictionary definition which says put it out there, but the important part is not full disclosure or partial disclosure, but when and the process. Because full disclosure, just by definition, is you disclose everything. When and how is the bigger issue. And that's later, right?
But do we really disclose everything in full disclosure?
You disclose
It's debatable,
much
right?
more than you should. Let's just say when people disclose full disclosure, they disclose much more than is reasonably necessary to accomplish what the goal should be.
So again, I think everybody probably actually knows what what the definition of full disclosure is, and it is a question of it's honestly the whole disclosure debate is it's a politics and religion. These are topics that one is not supposed to bring up in polite company. Good thing I'm here, right? So no, I mean I think ostensibly the proponents of full disclosure are saying that they're doing it in order to give everybody sort of an even playing ground, and whether or not that's actually the case, we actually don't have a whole lot of data that really supports that actually protects more people. We don't have a lot of attack data based on that. So I'd be interested in seeing if someone can actually figure out a way to measure some of these things objectively. I'm all about the objective, So anyway.
So there really are two things going on in the phrase full disclosure. There's the discussion of when a flaw is discussed publicly, and there's the question of what is the actual announcement. These are actually two completely orthogonal questions. Do you disclose to the public the moment you find the flaw? Maybe you give a lot of information, maybe you give a little. And then there's the question of, what are you actually going to admit? There are people who say that you should, wait until the vendor gets a patch, and then when you actually disclose, you shouldn't provide any information. It's important to realize, as much of a, responsible disclosure kind of guy that I am, I still went out with, here is the DNS attack. Here is exactly how you do it. Here's all the damage you can do with this particular attack. And the reason why is, if we don't have the actual, I'm a believer of the full disclosure ethos, that if we don't have the actual data on what can go wrong, us defenders are going to become stupid. We will, quite literally, defend against ghosts, things we don't know what they are, don't know how they work, we just sort of guess and we just sort of assume, and that scares me, because I have seen, frankly, very weak certification programs, very weak compliance programs, and I can't even say how many times I've been asked to turn off my cell phone on an airplane as if it mattered during takeoff and landing whether I was looking at a glowing screen. It keeps me up at night worrying that if we have insufficient disclosure, we're going to turn into the cell phone on plane guys.
That was excellent. But I have to be honest with you, panelists, no one actually stuck to just the definition of what you personally thought full disclosure was. You went into, past, present, future. That's okay, right? The next thing is the process of disclosure, right? And what the fact of the matter is, Blackhat exists today because it is a forum by which we do provide collaborative, collective, somewhat structured data, if you will, to disclose vulnerabilities, and exploits. That's why we have Blackhat. That's why DEF CON started, right? Because no one would really pay attention and listen. So my next question is, there's a gazillion different exploits, risks, bugs, fixes that are out there. And on a daily basis. Right now, we probably just went through 15 standing on the stage alone that are being posted somewhere, God knows where, right? How do you filter through that? Which one do you pick first? And is there a trusted entity by which, if you're on the receiving end of a disclosure, let's say you're at Microsoft and someone submits an exploit or a bug or an issue that they found, which one do you go to first? Because I'm sure you get, how many a day would Microsoft get exploits or disclosures posted? Probably 50, 60 from anybody. No? Someone reports to you, XYZ is identified in IE. XYZ is identified in Windows 8. Which one do you pick first? Who does what?
So this is a direct question for me.
It is.
So thanks. There's a triage process. Obviously, every vendor has to have a triage process. Obviously we have actually a bug bar that we hold to, and it goes through our testing, our repro, and we determine based on the rules of our bug bar what the severity is, criticality, and that affects the triage of how we prioritize vulnerabilities. So every vendor has their own internal processes on how they do this, but it's essentially a triage process.
Okay, so triage process. How do you determine time to respond?
What do you mean? When we receive a vulnerability report from somebody, we acknowledge them, that we received that report
How do you
within 24 hours. So is that?
That's right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so to the other panelists, acknowledging that something is received within 24 hours, a canned response, thank you for your inquiry, we'll get back to you in a week or two. What would be the mechanism that we should be addressed for responding to a full disclosure entry, right? Because one of our problems that we have here today is all of these are not being addressed in a timely manner. Look at the ATM issue we're dealing with. Who attended that session? Excellent. Last year it was pulled, was it not, from Blackhat? So we had a session last year that was to be presented at Blackhat in regards to exploits and vulnerabilities associated with ATMs. It was pulled by the individual's corporation that he worked for and also their customer, who was an ATM vendor. They said, you can't show this at Blackhat 2009. That was a year ago. You would expect then, a year later, that vulnerability might be addressed, correct? The issue herein lies, we showed it this year, 2010. Instead of one, there were 3 vulnerabilities. No one did anything in a year, even though Blackhat pulled it. No one addressed or fixed anything. Now we have disclosure at Blackhat 2010 with not just 1, but 3 different vulnerabilities associated with an ATM. So the question really is, what happened in a year? Going back to, how do you address it and what's the time to respond? Instead of giving a canned response, we'll get back to you in 6 months. We'll get back to you in 3 months. What would your expectation be?
Frankly, just on an editorial side, I think the irony of Juniper Networks telling, who was it, Barnaby Jack, to pull his presentation is incredibly hypocritical, given that Juniper Networks hired the guy that ISS fired for releasing the Cisco vulnerability.
Yeah, okay.
So I think that Juniper Network, frankly, has no right to tell anybody to shut the hell up. So anyway, with that out of the way, there's an issue. I frankly don't care if ATMs are insecure for the most part, because it doesn't affect me directly. It affects the banks directly. Let the banks go ahead and complain to the ATM vendors that they're not going to use their ATMs if they're not fixed. Where are the bank's responsibilities and the vendors for throwing out this money that are pretty much able to be hacked at random? The problem is like you're looking at things like hacking ATMs. In this case, yes, the vendor had a year to correct these issues. That's issue number 1. That should have been addressed, and if right now the vendor is screwing the banks over, and if the banks want to let themselves be screwed over, that's their problem, because right now they're the ones who are on the hook for the money. As far as who else is out there and doing things on the timeline, that's an issue of the vendors are ignoring the process, so go ahead, have at them, get all the money you want. I'm not going to do it because it'd be a crime, but if you're going to do it, it's sort of like, I'll just leave it there. But.
So what's the benefit of full
Actually,
disclosure in that case, right?
Can I reply to that?
Absolutely.
So this is one of these situations where it's so important that we have discussion of what's actually happening. The model that you just discussed said, well, the risk is to the banks, so this is the bank's problem. But you know, actually we have this problem that there are, I don't know, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of ATMs by Triton with default passwords, and by which it means you walk up to an ATM, you hit a few keys, and the receipt printer just starts printing out people's credit card numbers. Okay, that's not just the bank's problem, because the bank's liability starts at $50. And if you're sitting there with thousands of credit card numbers, you can start taking money out of them. And it becomes everyone's problem. The reality is that security is a new request and a new engineering requirement. Desktop computers were the first things that really got on board with remediating errors. You know, if you start a new engineering requirement in 2001, 2002, you know, you've got this huge legacy issue to deal with. Desktops came first, but man, there's industry after industry that are having to come to terms with what we now consider normal. ATMs are in, but yeah, routers were 2005, and you know, printers never actually got remediated. And even outside of IT, we're seeing stuff with medical devices and so on. You know, it's just a drumbeat over and over and over again. We can't expect everything to run on the schedule that we've evolved to at great expense with desktop computing, but does everything need to get better? Yeah.
I'll respond quickly. I was wrong. Because, again, my threat model was not there where he did, because I didn't realize those were the implications of the drive-by. Because in that case, frankly, I would damn well love to see, I hate class action lawyers. They are really the scum of the earth. But generally, I would love to see a class action lawsuit against both the banks who continue to use it for not forcing the people to do it right, as well as the people who are putting out that equipment. Because if they're keeping the vulnerabilities out there knowingly, and people are buying these things knowingly, and you can't tell me a bank should not have some concept of security, because that's why I said they should have the liability, because they're knowingly allowing these things to be purchased. Well, I don't want people's data to be stolen, but frankly, at this point, the banks are just as responsible as the firm for continuing to use faulty products.
We have a question in the audience.
If Barnaby Jack did that without, if he did that without providing the opportunity for the people to fix it, then yeah, I think he should be held liable for allowing the set of crimes to continue. Would the ATM vendor have done anything about it in the intervening years? If the ATM vendor did not do anything about it again, you're talking about the hypotheticals, but the hypotheticals are if you create a potential for damage which cannot be otherwise corrected. You know, the case would be if somebody could prove that the vendors actually knew. Because honestly, one of the problems with quote-unquote responsible or full disclosure is that we're talking about, like, for example, I forgot what this specific attack was. There was just a vulnerability announced with Microsoft's products that's been in the product for more, like the actual software where there's a vulnerability was vulnerable for more than a decade, and it was vulnerable, but nobody knew the vulnerability was there. So without knowing that there was a potential to exploit it, we really didn't have a right to complain that Microsoft should have fixed something that wasn't there. Same thing with the ATM vendor. If the ATM vendor did not know that it was there and they were given the opportunity to fix it, that would be great. If they weren't given the opportunity to fix it, unfortunately, the fact is that all those terrible things that would have happened, according to him, would have just as easily come true, but there was no chance for anybody to proactively protect themselves.
Just real quick on that, I'm sorry, Dan. Just real quickly, in looking at the report, because I actually did the research on 2008, 2009, and 2010 Blackhat briefings, vulnerabilities released over the last 3 years. Nicole Tatro and I did it. And one of the things I looked at, and that's why I'm explicitly bringing up the ATM issue, is responsible disclosure. And there was responsible disclosure given in this case 6 months prior to the subject presentation in 2009. Now we're talking 18 months worth of responsible disclosure. So yes, in this case, I can tell you there was responsible disclosure. Dan? Oh, no, go ahead. Do you have another question? Do you want me to do that? Oh, all right. Thank you.
Sure. Is this on? So there was a private disclosure to the vendor, right? And there was some period of time, and then the talk got called. The vendor's done. I think they've done nothing in 18 months now. Okay.
And there's 2 more.
Okay. So the question being, the private disclosure does not seem to have motivated the vendor in this case. Yeah, the details being public, does that provide motivation? And that's the question I'd like to
No,
bring up.
frankly, I'll go out. I mean, I will go further and say if what is described is the case, I am fully for somebody shutting their ass down. I mean, and frankly, if they had 6 months of notice and not put it out there, given the potential damage that they would have allowed to theoretically occur, they should be shut down by people. Because if the SEC, well, who SEC?
Well, you got to
Or
prove
the
FFIEC.
FFIEC.
So
But I mean,
we're not getting into regs.
yeah, but
Lara.
anyway.
Okay.
They should shut them down.
Okay. The ultimate customer of a disclosure is not the vendor. The ultimate customer is the user. It's the person whose money's at stake. It's the person whose data at stake. Now, if someone ends up just dropping the information on the public, just on day one, what's the public response? What should it really be? Well, man, someone ought to fix this. And who's the most qualified group to fix a problem in software? The people who actually wrote the software in the first place. So that's why there's value in talking with the vendor, because they're in the best position to do something about it. Now, just because they're in the best position doesn't mean they will or doesn't mean they won't. They might. The goal of responsible disclosure has always been to get the right people on the case. But if they're not on the case, then it has to go to the users and the public that has their data at risk and their funds at risk. You know, in light of realizing what's going on with ATMs, what's going on with default passwords, what's going on with remote vulnerabilities, I got to tell you, I feel like I don't want to stop at a convenience store ATM anymore. I want to go to an actual bank storefront. It's an inconvenience to me, but this is an ability for me to manage my risk. And that's a freedom, and that's a decision that I am being allowed to make only because I have the data. Would I want this data if it hadn't actually had some delay to have there be an opportunity for the problem to be fixed? The best case scenario is every ATM in the world is fixed. If I can't have the best case scenario, well, at least I need to know the data to mitigate what is my money and my data at risk, not theirs.
So that's a good point, but remember what we do for a living? So we have the brain matter to understand, and I don't do things online very much either when it comes to paying. I go to the bank myself too. I still write it out. So I'm with you on that one, Dan. But the general public doesn't understand it. How many of you have gotten that letter already from, Johnny Smith's bank saying your information could have been breached? Well, what good is that? Tell me when it is. And that's the problem we have. So the general population, in my opinion, is they're complacent. I, as a security professional, 24 years in this industry, I got 4 in a month. I'm at the point where I'm just like, whatever. Tell me when it is breached. So the reality is we understand that, but my mother doesn't know that. And she understands convenience of going to the bank to pull the money out. So it's a little bit different when we're talking about the common public with the ATM issue, where we know we can address it from doing it in a different way. Katie.
So I'm hearing a lot of assumptions and a lot of bucketization of all vendors are like this, and a lot of assumptions about what goes on, in terms of vulnerability handling processes in vendors. And the truth of the matter is, for those of you who have reported vulnerabilities to more than one vendor, your mileage may vary. There are definitely different processes that go on, and it's funny, when you were trying to summarize what I had said earlier, saying that we send a canned response. It's absolutely not a canned response. This is from a real human. This is how Microsoft handles it. There's a human, reading each and every mail that comes into us. Some vendors do the automated thing, but not all vendors do. Some vendors are transparent, when with their processes and where they are in their triage process, where they are in their repro of the case. where they are, in terms of what their estimate is of how long it might take to fix the issue, and some vendors aren't, and so I just want to, make this point very, very specifically that, you can't just lump in all vendors in one category. Similarly, you can't lump all, finders in one category either. So there's a lot of nuances here that I think are being, it's almost like a caricature that's being painted here, and that's absolutely not the appropriate way to view these things. One more point, because y'all have had the mics for a very long time, so give me a minute here. One more point, is that another big thing is there's a lot of assumptions about what went on, with that particular issue or any particular issue, and the fact of the matter is, I hear that there's just a need for more transparency, more communication, more coordination. That's exactly what we want, right? So I think that's what we want across the board, and we can work towards that together. Okay, now you can have it out.
I just wanted to say I agree.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, well, actually, I think that I can see both sides of the argument, and as long as we are talking about, I mean, I think that it's easy. It's an easy discussion. It's an easy argument when we are talking about evidently critical vulnerabilities threatening an infrastructure. So we are talking about a very pervasive vulnerability in ATM systems. And then
that was just an example,
and
though.
Yeah, I know, but it's that's another critical. I mean, even more critical example. And I think that these examples are actually, pretty easy to get people to agree upon, because with some few exceptions, no one really wants to see the DNS infrastructure crash and burn, right? So I think that everyone would agree that what Dan coordinated was an extraordinary effort, and I would not know who could advocate a different handling of that type of vulnerability. Yeah, differences in details, but in general, I don't think that anybody sane would advocate publicly disclosing a vulnerability without trying to coordinate a response on such a critical system.
Somebody did.
So, yeah.
So that's another point, though. How quick? No, I'm teasing. Go ahead.
No, it's very welcome.
Just to say, that disclosure went very well, and there's a lot of excellent coordination, and it was built on the backs of 10 years of experience. I mean, this is a community of people that have all had to fix a lot of bugs, and if there hadn't been that experience, it would have been a much harder thing. So yes, that went well, but it wasn't like a shot in the dark that came out of nowhere. This is part of a series of very good work.
Yeah.
And that's an excellent point. That brings me to the next point of point in time anything, right? So let's just, stupid simple, not even related to, responsible disclosure. We're talking about, pen testing, vulnerability assessments. We all know those are point in time, right? You run it, you get your scan, you're like, oh, wow, I need to fix this. It's red, yellow, green, whatever, right? At the end of the day, though, once that scan is run, how meaningful is it really? It might be meaningful for trending and analysis. Am I better when I run it next month, or is my security parameters worse? But at the end of the day, point in time doesn't work anymore. We need near real time of just about everything and anything, especially now that we're moving to the virtualization, cloud platform, hands-off, remote, around the world, you name it. So the point is, when we were talking about how long would you wait, and someone mentioned it, and remember what the exact reference was, but how long was someone willing to wait, or when's the proper time? And I think about certain things like, how many of you would wait in line in Starbucks for like 30 minutes to get their triple venti non-fat latte? Oh yeah, that line's out the door, but I know I'm going to get that coffee, and all right, I'm willing to wait for it. That's a different kind of a patient wait category, if you will. Take it to the technology side of the house when we're saying, I want it fast, I want it furious, I told you there was a bug, I told you to fix it, you didn't do it, boom, I'm exploiting. I think that's the point where we're going to start to get to when we're talking about responsible disclosure. Is it even worth saying, hey, there's a problem, knowing we have this year, 2, 10-year lag or research and development project that we have to do to get to a point to fix it, right? So really, what's the reality of the future? Not even today. We know we have issues with responsible disclosure, whether it's too fully disclosed or time to fix or time to address, whatever. Where do you think the future state of all this is going to be? That's my concern.
For as far as the future state now, frankly, I don't think the future state should change from what the current state should theoretically be. You have to, what is a reasonable period of time to get a response? What is? Well, the fact is, it varies depending on the application, the vendor, and things like that. Like, just for example, you're not going to go ahead and expect, well, this is like, again, apples and oranges comparison for the most part, but if you have a flaw in the fundamental aspect of Microsoft Windows, which is embedded in all versions of Windows for the last decade, that's going to take a variety of regression testing, impact tests, sorry, I'm speaking for you, but impact testing and everything like that. On the other hand, if you have a fairly straightforward application, like, well, again, a fairly straightforward application these days is hard to come up with, but let's say, let's say you have like a Cisco iOS vulnerability. It has less complexity than Microsoft Windows. I'm just using apples and oranges. But again, there's less complexity, and there should be a little bit of less regression testing, albeit the fact that it does have to communicate with millions of computers all over the place. But the problem is that it's like a bunch of imbeciles can find these vulnerabilities, and they expect the world to operate on their individual mindset. That's the problem that we're running into, where, oh, I want to do it now because, and frankly, even if it's not even their lack of patience most of the time, it's their desire for attention that would get it. They find a fundamental flaw, and it's like, wait a second, if they fix it, it's not newsworthy. And if they fix it, I'll get less attention. All I'll get is minor mention in like a technical note, as opposed to getting all the full disclosure that I see Dan Kaminsky getting or something like that. No offense. But the problem is, it's like I found vulnerabilities. I've worked with vendors that nobody's ever heard of before. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I don't care about the attention. The vulnerabilities have been fixed. The world's a better place, and I can live with that. But the problem is that you have other people that they just want the attention, or even if they don't care as much about the attention, they want it on their mindset without having the complexity of dealing with product development and things like that, and knowing the aspects of regression testing, that it's got to be tested on 30 different languages simultaneously before you can implement a patch in all over the world. Anyway.
Katie?
Well, okay, so I mean, you did cover a lot of the complexity issues, right? And that's absolutely has a lot to do with the ability for any vendor to come up with with a suitable way to address a vulnerability. But I think there's also some characterization of researcher motivations that it's a little bit more nuanced than that as well. Where I think it's not all of them are motivated by by the fame, right? So and you were citing yourself, yeah, you were saying you cited yourself as among those who's not, but I think ultimately the industry, the original question you had, right, is where do we go from here, right? So the original question, I would say that it is definitely time for us to all take an assessment of each other in this, in our roles and disclosure and everything. And it's a time for us to not polarize so much, because we're not all, definitely on one very, extreme end of the spectrum or another. There's relatively few. I think it's much more of like a bell curve type of situation. And as such, we really need a way to sort of operate interfaith. You know what I mean? Like I said, that it's a religious argument a lot of the times with disclosure, and we need a way to talk to each other, even when, and especially when, our disclosure philosophies are not completely in alignment. I mean, if we all agreed, 100% across the board, I'm pretty sure that we'd have no debate, right? So that's the. I think for us, it's a matter of making sure that we are participating, as part of the community, part of the security community, and that includes, other vendors, that includes customers, that includes, protection providers, and of course researchers. And we have a number of researchers of our own, who participate in the vulnerability, finding and disclosing, to other vendors. So anyway, my point is coordinated disclosure, or whatever you want to call it, it's about us being able to operate in this interfaith, type environment that we live in.
Yeah, actually, I'm still kind of two minds about this, because on one side, I agree. I mean, my company has always done a responsible disclosure, so we do appreciate that vendors need time to properly fix things. On the other hand, some experiences tell me that as soon as this becomes like an industry standard, there's going to be people that are going to kind of abuse it. I'm talking about personal experiences, but we have been through the threat of legal consequences about disclosing a cross-site scripting flaw into a web-based interface for an open source forensic tool. And that leaves about 2 products. And so just to rule out, it's not the one by Brian Carrier. So this leaves just the 1 product. And this, this made me think. It made me think because this was not a really high impact vulnerability. It was just something that we found during a penetration test. And basically, it could be reduced to very bad programming practices. A code monkey hired to program a specific part of the interface, not really understanding that if you are visualizing data that comes from a suspect hard drive, that data is considerably untrusted. So you should filter it before displaying it. And what were its consequences? Well, its consequences for that specific application were grievous, because you could, basically, a miscreant could construct files on his hard drive or even change something on his partitions in order to foil the visualization of any data on his computer drive. So serious for the application, but nothing critical, no emergencies, no liabilities for the company. So it's not like if I go and disclose this bug, this company is going to suffer from a liability for that.
So you're trying to categorize.
I'm trying to say that as soon as you imply, okay, this is the responsible way for doing disclosure, this is the good way for doing disclosure, and if you do it any other way, you're bound to be liable in some way for the damage that you cause. This means that smaller pen testing firms or single users that are going to do vulnerability disclosure on the side from their day job, they're going to be fearful about this. It's just exactly what happens under the DMCA for the copyright protection mechanisms.
So is it sort of like due diligence, right? If you put out there, I identified XYZ vulnerability or exploit that, even if you're a small vendor, and it's kind of like, you did your pen test and your vault testing, but you didn't do anything about it. Your report was really bad, that you have all these holes to fix, and you're supposed to be abiding by SOX and PCI, and rut-row, you get exposed, right? So now you're violating SOX and PCI because you knew you had vulnerabilities, but you didn't fix them. I'm trying to address your statement here. Does that mean, I'm trying to figure out what you said here. Does that mean if you're a smaller company and you found bugs and fixes, but you need more time to fix, where it's not that impactful, or it is, are you liable for, legal actions because you're aware of it, but yet you can't address it? Is that what you're trying to say?
I was seeing it the other way around, but actually it works this way around as well.
So, as a society, we want secure code. This is somewhat new. In 1999, society couldn't care less. In 2003, a whole bunch of people's computers stopped working. And then society started caring. As a member of the software industry, and I think most people in the software industry, really, really do not want product liability legislation on computer software. People kind of bring it up, and then they think about it for about 2 seconds and realize, not naming names, but there are companies that ship databases today that, if product liability existed, would not be able to ship again until the year 2023. So, screeching brick wall gone, and just this industry destruction. So how do we resolve? We have an absolutely strong need for secure code with a desperate need to have this job not run by the lawyers. And the thing that has sort of evolved is this disclosure system of when things go wrong, there is a amount of pain. You have to release faster than your normal release cycle, but not so slow that it isn't, it's a priority 3 thing. No. I mean, you actually have to put some heft behind it. The advantage of having, if you can hit the sweet spot, you end up with motivation to do things like develop secure coding practices. Because the more secure your coding practices, at least in theory, the fewer of these events occur that require you to do out-of-band patching in some aspect. So all of this comes down to society needs secure code, which means what we do as researchers, the legitimacy it gets, the reason the articles go ahead and provide not just attention, but positive attention on researchers is the work we do is making software safer. The danger, the risk, is if the actual disclosures happen in a way that is so obviously not caring at all about what happens in terms of social benefit and social value. If that's the context of the work that gets done, well then the legitimacy of all research gets called into question. Our ability to make computers safer and to make the information infrastructure safer becomes threatened, and from a raw dollar design situation, the risk of product liability on our industry increases.
Going back to the original question that Pam asked, I don't think you're ever going to get agreement among people. I mean, it's impossible. Stefano with the little vendors, everybody else with the big vendors, all the big vendors get together. It doesn't matter. There's hundreds of thousands of people out there developing software that are all going to have their same standards. There's everybody from large companies and internal vulnerability finders like people in ISS to the people inside Microsoft themselves to everywhere else that are going to do things responsibly. And then you got the imbeciles out there that are dying to get a vulnerability so that they could throw it out there as quickly as possible. You're not going to get any concise, consolidated input. You are going to have to resort to product liability before vendors start to do things because there is a financial motivation. And I love to see liability lawsuits against lawyers. I hate class action attorneys. Let me get that clearly straight. But at the same time, it's like sometimes it takes class action lawsuits or it takes regulations because here's the thing. I don't think society, a good portion of society, really cares about secure software. They think it's there, it kind of works. If they really cared about secure software, nobody would do online banking anymore. Nobody would buy a Mac anymore. I mean, especially Mac. I mean, it's like, oh, it's the people's fault because they're holding the phone wrong, that the phone doesn't work. You can't convince an Apple user that their products have any flaws whatsoever. You got to have, and that's the problem. People don't really want or care about software. And until vendors start thinking, because there's musts and there's shoulds, and basically, unless something is a must, people should all over themselves. He said it close, so I'll say it close too. Basically, unless a vendor thinks that they have to do something, they won't. Microsoft had their Come to Jesus talk back in 2003 where they basically shut the company down because they're not going to have major vulnerabilities again, and that security was a process. Before that, it was like one of the most... Well, it's a process now. I'm not saying it's perfect because here's the thing. Everybody says we're security. We're not security professionals. If we're security professionals, you should get out because you're an outright failure. Because the definition of security is freedom from risk, right? Look it up. Definition of security is freedom from risk. If we're going to do your job right, you're a risk management professional. And that means that there's always going to be losses. Your job is to control what losses there will be. Period. If anybody thinks there's going to be perfect software, you're delusional, no matter what process it is. Again, how can we make the process reasonable to mitigate any likelihood of loss? That's the type of things people should be asking themselves. If there is a vulnerability, what can we do to reduce the likelihood of that vulnerability existing? And then what can we do to accelerate the process of fixing it? That's the issue that nobody's saying. If people think people care about security, no. The end users don't give a damn about security because they're using everything, and everything people are using are insecure. Nobody should be going to an ATM machine after the articles came out today, but they are.
But not everyone's aware of it. That's the issue.
Let me give you an example. Sorry, one last thing. One last thing, and I'll give you the mic, and you can keep it.
Please.
Basically,
Security.
just think of it this way. How many people remember Blaster Worm? Blaster was announced during DEF CON or Blackhat or whatever it was in 2003. And what happened? The media came out and said, your computers are screwed. Your computers will break. Hackers will take over the internet. And by the way, just download the fix from Microsoft. It's free. It's automatic. And then all of a sudden, a month later, people had a month of headline-making news. Top of the news broadcast, and yet a month later, like hundreds of millions of computers were affected by Blaster. People don't care about security, and if you think they care, you're delusional.
So you're actually touching on a really important point about the shared responsibility that we all have as part of the ecosystem. So, the vendor could actually have the fix out, but if the customers don't have, a decent way to deploy those fixes, then guess what? That's going to be, the point where they're really at risk, right? So, there is absolutely a shared responsibility among all of us, right? So the vendors obviously have the responsibility to work in secure development practices and improve the security quality of their code. And we've done it at Microsoft with the security development lifecycle, and that is actually the proven software security assurance process that has been proven to reduce the number and severity of vulnerabilities that are found in our code. And it is a life cycle, and the end of at the end of that life cycle, there is the response process, and that's what we're talking about right here. Is that just that piece of that entire life cycle? But the knowledge that we get from those residual vulnerabilities that made it through and slipped through some of those earlier software security assurance processes, we feed that knowledge back in order to try to eliminate those classes of vulnerabilities in the future. And that is what software vendors and hardware vendors, any vendor, is really going to need to do to actually start making a dent, in their security of their own products. But yeah, I think Dan wants to say something.
I think Stefano's next.
Yeah, no, but it was just a quick comment on that, because you when talking about the easiness of applying fixes, I just remembered Claudio's talk from a few minutes ago, and basically we have pulled from his talk a vulnerability which the virtualization vendor, I will not even need to tell you which virtualization vendor it is, wasn't able to patch in time. So we were in touch with them and they weren't able to release that. We pulled that from the demo. But there was another vulnerability which we actually demonstrated, which has been patched. And the patches over the vendor website, in the knowledge base, hidden behind a knowledge base article, with the usual sign, beware of the leopard before you enter, because it's very hidden, and no one will ever get to deploy that, unless they realize that they have a problem, and they go there and specifically download and fix. And this is, in my opinion, another point where most vendors, most mainstream vendors, Microsoft is a prime example, are really doing a lot of work to try to get people to install patches timely, in trying to make patches easy to install. A lot of other vendors either cannot, or in most cases have not yet realized that actually making it easy for people to patch their systems is a key component of making them more secure. Yeah, it's way more than that, but that's a key component of it.
So, I'm not a car person. I want to take my car. Oh, well, I'm actually hanging out in New York lately, so that's actually a yes. But I do own a car, and I want to take my key and turn the ignition and go places. And I have friends who love cars. They have custom tires. They bling those things out. You know what? I don't even want to check my oil gauge. And you know what? I don't care. I still want it to turn on. That doesn't mean I don't check my oil. That doesn't mean I don't want the car to go. I want both. I'm unreasonable. Deal with it. That's kind of how it is with security. I don't want to get hacked. Using the voice of an average user. Average user may not want to do a thing about maintaining their computer, but they still do not want to get hacked. And if they get hacked, they're really, really unhappy. And so it's not that users don't care about security. It's that you're blaming users. It's that you're saying, well, if you did care, you would dedicate some non-zero amount of time in your life to paying attention to this. And you know what? I want to dedicate not one single second of my life to looking at the oil of my car. And so I understand, and people are laughing here. Look, I'd like to extend this one level beyond. One of the most important fixes in Windows XP SP2 was the deployment of mandatory automated patching. Because that's what took, you can say users should go ahead and go online and find the patch. No, users should do nothing. The computer should deal with it. Every user interface that has ever been designed for a patching application was wasted work that never should have happened. The patching interface on Xbox, the patching interface on Java, the patching interface on Winamp, the Windows experience has been polluted by user experiences that should not exist. Someday, there will be one patching interface on Windows. It'll cover every application, and it will be invisible. And I tell you, whenever this happens, will be a glorious day for security.
Hold on. He's making predictions about what we're eventually going to be able to do. What, 1 second here, seriously. Look, that's a beautiful utopia that you're painting out there. But the key thing there is that's not going to happen unless we can actually start working together with the other vendors and everything. We are all growing up in this industry at different paces. Some of us took some hard lessons earlier in the game, and we're much further ahead than a lot of the people who have not had the wonderful experience of being a market leader. So, that's the thing. So when we do actually try to reach out to other organizations to help them get to, benefit from some of our experiences. That's one of the purposes of the Microsoft Vulnerability Research Program when we report vulns to other vendors. That's part of the goal of the SDL outreach team that actually focuses on bringing the SDL to third parties. This is about platform security. He's right about that, but it's not some, magical thing that can, the flights of angels are going to open up in the sky. This is going to take work from all of us.
Sorry, one quick thing.
I have no control.
Yeah, okay.
Who's the biggest guy in the
Yeah.
room? Can I have him up here?
Now, basically, I'll just respond to Dan because I agree with almost most of what he says. But the reality, though, is that, yes, he does have to get oil changed. The reality is when I buy anything, period, that makes my life easier, what Dan is saying is he wants all the benefits but none of the responsibility, none of the cost. That's important because it's like what happens if you walk into a car dealership and say, hey, I just purchased a $30,000 car, and now you expect me to put gas in the car every week and pay $40 every week to drive my car that I just paid $30,000 for? Are you out of your mind? And then an oil change every 3,000 miles? I paid $30,000 for the car. But what happens is people buy a computer, they pay $1,000 for a computer if they buy a good one these days, and then it's like, I have to pay $50 to renew my antivirus, anti-firewall software, and all that sort of stuff. I paid $2,000 or whatever for my computer, and now I have to pay $50 a year. Are you out of your mind? And that's what we let the average computer do these days. And then we call that blaming the user. Hell yes, I'm blaming the user because they want the benefits of the computer, and they're living in some dream world that there's no responsibility or cost that comes with it. Yes, if you get a benefit, there is a cost, period. You want sidewalks, you pay taxes. Sorry.
So I actually totally agree with you, but my point is this. When you buy that car, and you don't put gas in it, or you don't put oil in it, or you don't get it fixed, and the engine seizes up, does your warranty work? Are you going to get it fixed? Nope. Guess what, user? You're going to pay to get it fixed because you violated your warranty. Same thing, going back to what you said. People want things to work. They make the assumption that it's fixed, that they can do whatever they want, and if it breaks or if they get exploited, someone else is responsible for addressing that issue and getting them their $50 back, or saving their credentials. At the end of the day, the common consumer needs to take some level of responsibility. They must be liable for something. Something along the way. Common passwords, for God's sake, anything. But we cannot keep passing that off onto big business or the security people to address that issue, because we're just not getting anywhere. 90% of what is out there today is a common user. My mother is on Facebook feeding some dog that I have no idea. I swear to God, it's not a joke. I swear, it makes me sick. She's a senior citizen, and she changed her flight because she had to feed a dog or else it would run away. I didn't know what she was talking about. But this is what I'm saying. And if her dog ran away, that was an issue. God forbid if she couldn't feed the dog because she had a security exploit. But at the end of the day, there must be some level of responsibility for a common user for doing irresponsible acts. And that's really where we need to get to. We can't just all pass that along the way. And I get it. I want my car to work. I get what you're saying. But we have this poor gentleman here who's been exceedingly patient.
Okay, so we've been discussing what the users should do, what the security researchers should do. I have a question to the panel. So are we going to see a day wherein the companies are going to have a scoreboard, let's say, in which they say, okay, we knew about this vulnerability on this day, we are working on this patch. We knew about this vulnerability on this day, we are still working on the patch. And maybe to help all those imbeciles who want some fame, also put their names there up. Is that going to happen?
So you're talking about public, kind of like a big matrix? Here's Microsoft, here's Red Hat, here's blah, blah, blah.
From the vendors themselves. Okay, this is a scoreboard or scorecard, and we are working for the last so many days.
I mean, frankly, as far as attribution goes, Microsoft and other vendors put out a release, they say, and credit goes to, whoever today it was from ISS. People get that credit. The problem is that, that's one issue. The credit's there. As far as vendor scoreboards go, it'll look really good. I don't think it'll happen because a lot of vendors aren't going to do it, and it does Microsoft no good to say, well, we had this level of vulnerability, because how do you equate something that's like a minor fix for some crappy program that they have that nobody uses compared to a fundamental flaw in like Microsoft, or let's say a fundamental bug in Microsoft, like Windows? There's a difference because it's not all vulnerabilities are the same, and it's not all like you're going to replace, critical vulnerabilities are fixed within X number of days. That could happen, but maybe you'll get Microsoft doing it. Maybe you'll get Sun doing it. Well, does Sun exist?
Kind of all be the same window frame there?
Yeah.
Not 5 years,
they
but maybe a year?
But the problem is that nobody is going to do it when they suck. You're not going to see Mac or Apple do that, like Mac OS was patched within so many days.
So I think there's also a fundamental oversimplification of all criticals are in this some same category here. An architecture critical is going to take a lot more work, a lot more testing than a one-off implementation error. And they can both be rated as critical impact, but they are not equal by any means. Similarly. A vulnerability in a shared library. This is absolutely not all vulns are created equal, and you cannot make some arbitrary mandatory window for severity, because that's not actually the operative. That's not the operative in determining how long it might take to address a particular issue.
Can we have our mic back?
Yes.
Oh, you want?
No,
Andrea has a question.
I just want to keep it up.
You look frightened.
It's been a long day.
It has been. Okay, so we've talked about personal responsibility. We've talked about the company responsibilities on the program side. What do you guys think about the idea that some governments have that the patches should go to the government first and the government can patch their computers first before the rest of the user community patches? And I won't say what nationalities do that.
No, I'll take that because, frankly, the government has a, I'm going to say, a stupid philosophy that most of the critical infrastructure will remain in private hands, and that if the government says, well, let us fix government computers first, in many cases, I don't care about some of the computers in the government. I care about more of the critical infrastructure computers that are left vulnerable because the government says, oh, we'll let the critical infrastructure companies do whatever the hell they want. Holding it back for just the government, it would be nice maybe for some of the, well, frankly, I would like to assume it would be unnecessary for all the computers that are out there, like on critical systems, because they should not be attached to online networks, but that's a separate issue.
So, Andrew, was your question not so much just government, but critical infrastructure maybe? Or is it across the board? So SCADA, all of that, right? Oof.
Oh, yeah, if it's SCADA, just write it off. It'll never get
Yeah, so a lot of theoretical models will say, well, there's us and there's them. There's government and there's not government. There's important and there's not important. And, theoretical models are nice and, slick, but everything is blurry these days. You have your purely public assets. You have your public-private assets. You have your mostly private but highly regulated assets. You have your mostly private, used to be highly regulated, but a little less now assets. And the idea that there's a line is there is no line, and that's the problem. Or not problem, but that's ultimately the idea that government should patch first. What does that mean? Is really a question. And it means nothing.
And when you say highly regulated, geographical location, regulations don't cross boundaries very well. Of course, we're not on the same sheet of music, right? Question. He said, that's all right. He said it a couple times.
So if you did give it to governments first, who here thinks that the government could actually keep the secret? And second, which government?
You mean which government agency or what?
No, there's 190 governments, so even more than that. I wanted to just chime in on one of the things that the gentleman over here said, because I think your question was not correctly understood, or maybe I understood it wrongly. But what you were describing looks more like a database of patches under development, so that you know that something is coming up. That was what I heard from your question. And actually some companies, primarily vulnerability research companies, are doing that. Yeah, that's the only one that deals with another huge company that takes a lot of time to fix bugs. So, and let's leave it at that. But
You have a question? No, he's saying 5 minutes. You're telling me to shut up in 5 minutes?
Yep.
I'm doing my job. I'm giving you 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's cool. Thanks. So, regarding that question, that kind of makes sense. The problem is except from putting some pressure and not very effective at all on the vendor, what contribution does that give to the average user or administrator? Really none, because if you're an administrator and you're administering, let's put the elephant on the table, the Oracle patches. You already know that in a quarter you will get another bunch of patches. You already know that there's a lot of vulnerabilities that have already been disclosed to them and they're not patched yet. It's enough that you attend any course by David or by Alexander Kornbrust, and you will see 0 days, or even discover 0 days as part of the course, because it's very easy to find out vulnerabilities in some components of that database. And I'm not deliberately bashing Oracle. It's just because it's probably the type of list of vulnerabilities that spurred your question. What does that list? What good does that list do? Not much, in my opinion. I don't know, but
No, it's up to you.
No, go ahead.
We only have 5 minutes.
I know. So we wanted to kind of 3 minutes. Okay, so we're gonna have to talk at Pam speed, right? Okay. So just real quickly, a standards guidance kind of perspective, right? So putting standards or guidance around anything, let's just say, like you seem to have a very well developed, historical practice, and Microsoft, we all know, does for vetting and distributing, so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, are we evolving too quickly to even adhere to a standard or a guideline, if you will, because things are evolving so fast, right? So we're having a hard time keeping up with deployment, when to talk about it, what to disclose, what to test, what to evaluate, who to notify, when to notify, is it government, is it not, is it big business? So at the end of the day, will we ever get to a collective understanding on what responsible disclosure is and what the process is associated with it? We're always, I think, going to kind of keep peddling to get there, right?
Okay, so Pam, the answer is no. There will not be a responsible disclosure until it's regulated. The fact of the matter is there's too many players out there to both do it as a corporation, to respond quickly with their own, fixing their own things, as we've seen with these ATMs, as we've seen with Mac compared to everybody else with DNS vulnerability. There's not going to be a consolidated way. All of a sudden, Juniper hires the guy that disclosed Cisco vulnerability who worked at ISS. Then they have now it's me, and they change their mind. So all of a sudden it's okay to pull presentations when they had much more time to theoretically fix the thing. So there's not going to be anything, because right now it's a should, it's not a must, and people do whatever they damn well please when they don't have to do anything else.
I think that, I think that there's absolute room for evolution here. That's what we've been doing in this industry, right? We've been learning from the mistakes of the past, the mistakes of ourselves and others, and there's room for evolution and efficiencies, that can be shared among all of the different roles in disclosure. I've been working on the ISO standard for it was originally started as ISO standard for responsible disclosure, proposed by the Canadian national body, and I've been working on that as the U.S. subject matter expert for that particular draft for the past 3 years. Has that draft changed a lot in the past 3 years? Absolutely, and in fact, because of a suggestion from Jake Koons from Open Security Foundation after we talked at the RSA panel, after the RSA panel on disclosure that I was on, we were able to bring the idea of dropping the word responsible from the title of that ISO draft, and that actually was ratified in April of this year. So now it's no longer responsible vulnerability disclosure, it's just called vulnerability disclosure. But the point is, that's all evolving. There's some standardization efforts. Is it going to catch everybody? Absolutely not. But we're all trying to move towards a better solution than the one we have now, and it's going to take all of us.
There are a lot of things we could talk about in terms of the definitions of disclosure and the agreements of disclosure, in terms of what is done, in terms of what we call it. I got to be honest, I do think de-emotionalizing the subject is unquestionably a good thing, but, there's no doubt in the public's mind that there's an irresponsible way to disclose a vulnerability. Hey, I'm going to disclose something by hacking into every website on the planet and publishing, every website is just the exploit. This is clearly an irresponsible way to do things. There's no question that there's an irresponsible way. There's always been a question that there's a responsible way. So I have to say, I'm kind of nervous about losing the possibility, the admitted and accepted and proclaimed value of disclosure. When we called it responsible disclosure, we at least knew there was a good way to do it. After, I like the de-emotionalization, but I'm a little worried about the loss that it cost us. The real question at the end of the day is timelines, though. What is the appropriate timeline going to be? As a statement of fact, unquestionably, not all bugs take the same amount of time, but just as equally as a statement of fact, bugs can't have an indefinite timeline to be fixed, or else they just won't be.
Right, because they evolve, right? By the time you fix it, it's morphed into something else. So just quickly, and then I'll let each one of you do your closing comments, if you will. When you talked about it has to be regulated, right? We were talking about, I actually have to agree with you, because I'm just going to point out a couple of quick things from talking from what used to be standards and what used to be guidelines, which are now legislation, right? Let's talk about PCI. It was a standard and a guideline. You didn't really have to do it, and if you violated PCI, you'll get a fine. Well, we all know that those little fines didn't happen until, Heartland came about, right? The big old breach there. So at the end of the day, PCI was a guideline and a standard. It was not a legislation. You didn't go to jail for it, if you will. That now has legislation backing. In the state of Nevada, actually, you must be PCI compliant or you break the law, per se. The other thing that I want to bring to attention is HIPAA is another one. It was a standard and a guideline, and now we have HIPAA High Trust. So really, we had nice standards, nice guidance, nice guidelines. You can use it, you can adopt it, let's be universal. And they didn't have enough teeth in them. You couldn't hold people accountable. Now they're being held accountable. So I have to kind of side with Ira here, thinking someday I think there's going to be a level of accountability for responsible disclosure. And you wanted to say something real quick.
Yeah, well, I do like, I think that Dennis is perfectly right and right on the spot, because I do like the idea of having, you know, guidelines and community rules for doing things. But still, as a researcher, I do still want to have the possibility, if my conscience and my ethics asks me to do so, to do any kind of disclosure that I feel personally, and I think that that's an ethical point, so it's just a personal assessment, unluckily. I still want to have the freedom to disclose anything that I find in the case that I think that this benefits the community, the users, or the people, more than actually keeping it under a strictly regulated process. So I would say that I'm pretty much in favor of de-emotionalizing the thing, creating processes, creating standards. That thing I like. When you talk about regulation, and I'm European, so I should be the one pro-regulation and not the one against regulation, but when you talk about regulation, that really, really scares me, because regulation applied to security disclosure, in my mind, pops up with the DMCA and Ed Felton not being able to publish his research.
It's security, though, right? It's more than security.
Yeah, of course.
So, anyway, closing comments. Basically, I disagree with Stefano. No, he should not have the right to do whatever he pleases whenever he pleases. Because the thing is, by disclosing a vulnerability, you're impacting other people. And you're impacting of other people. If you make your rational disclosure and you have no idea what you're talking about, what you're thinking, and you impact society as a whole, you take down 100,000 ATMs or whatever it is just randomly without giving any warning, but it's so important. But you create an impact, you should be held liable for the impact that you create because you just had this thought process. Because if you let any idiot go around and say, I have this thought process that I really need this, I don't have money to pay for it, but I really need it, but it would help me make society so much better. No, you can't go around leaving people to their own wills when there's repercussions to other people. And frankly, I do think the word responsibility should be kept in place in closing, because as Spider-Man said, with great power comes great responsibility. And don't think that having vulnerabilities is not power. Vulnerability is knowledge, and knowledge is power. And again, when you have the ability to create damage to people you've never seen, they never know you, you have a responsibility to not create damage irresponsibly. And
That
again,
was more than 5 seconds.
yeah, but okay. Sorry. I thought you were saying closing remarks. I didn't take my 5. I'm just using my closing.
So, closing remarks, you know, I think that the variations of opinions, you know, in this are really this is what we have to work through together as an industry, you know. We're not going to get anywhere if we keep talking past each other, you know. So we really do need to be listening to each other. We need to be respecting each other's opinions. We need to be working towards something better, and that's not something that any one entity in disclosure can decide for another entity. So vendors can't, you know, call all the shots. Finders can't call all the shots. Coordinators can't call all the shots. So, and regulation is not going to solve that problem. I can tell you that much. You know, regulation is not going to help us all get along. And this is what we actually need to do. We actually need to take it from a politics focus to a people focus. This is about protecting people. So if we're all on that page, guess what? We're all on the same team. Let's stop fighting about it and work against the real adversary, who are the criminals, who are actually doing no disclosure, right? So let's focus on the actual outcome that we want, which is to get people safer. Of course, we're going to disagree on, you know, the best and most efficient road to that outcome. That's the point of the discussion. That's the point of coordinated vulnerability disclosure.
I think one of the best things that is going on right now in the disclosure debate is that it is actually happening. We're actually discussing what the rules should be. We're actually discussing what the names should be. We're not talking past each other. We're not waving our fingers at each other. There is engagement on both sides. And that is tremendous. It is the thing that we have been missing for some years. It is the thing that we have been suffering for, and I'm so happy to see it happening. So I'm just going to leave things at that.
I think that was an excellent closing statement. That is actually happening, and that it's happening on levels where everyone's opinion's being heard. I think you kind of mentioned that. So it can't just be an organization that's been here for 20 years and is dominant. Everyone's opinion matters. Everyone has input. I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank Stefano for his input, Ira for his, Katie for being in the hot seat a lot here. We really appreciate it. And Dan, thank you very much. I don't think that we have any time for questions, but I'm sure that if you corner any one of these individuals, they'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of Blackhat.
Thanks a lot.